So I undressed her down to her little knit top that she had on and put some long underwear bottoms on her and tucked her in real tight and kissed her goodnight. And
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. What in that statement from Patsy Ramsey is strange or interesting? Well, we're going to analyze that and we're going to address the question, did Patsy put JonBenet to bed in the next analysis? In the previous analysis, we dealt with the snow narrative, which is far more compelling than many realize. We also dealt with John and Patsy Ramsey behaving kind of weird, not talking to each other, and John apparently peeling off to do his own investigation without telling anyone. And after he came back, still not telling anyone about the basement window. All of that is very compelling stuff. But for this analysis, we want to explore an area that blows the intruder theory clean out of the water. You're not going to believe this. So what I want you to do is take the snow, no snow thing, whatever you believe regarding that, and the parents' strange or not strange behavior, whatever you believe about that, and mush it together into a snowball, and then do what Ditzy Luke Skywalker did, toss it over your shoulder.
Data, I cannot make bricks without clay.
Now what's interesting about when Sherlock Holmes does that is actually giving the officer a sort of a false evidence or evidence that's not going to be of any use, and the cop writes it down, runs off, and he's really just trying to get rid of him in order to make some space for him to do what he really wants to do. And so think about that idea as we cover this case and this analysis in this particular episode.
Data, I cannot make bricks without clay.
Of course, sometimes you can make bricks with a lot of clay that is kind of bullshit. It's not clay, it's actually bullshit clay. And so again, I want you to ask you, as we go through this whole thing about John's visit to the basement and that chair, that pesky little red chair, what does that really tell us about this case? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. By the way, we're also going to be looking at this whole idea of who broke the basement window and when was it broken. So look out for that. We're also going to deal with, did Patsy put JonBenet to bed? If you're finding this series worthwhile, if you're enjoying this series, please like, share, leave a comment. If you're really enjoying it, you can hit the thanks button and let's get started. So Lou Smith says, I remember in your report, did you ever go down to the basement? John Ramsey, I went. Doesn't say very much, does he? Lou Smith, who was with you at that time? John Ramsey, I was by myself. I'd gone down the basement. I came down the stairs. I went in this room here. This door was kind of blocked. Now, let's pay attention to that. This door was kind of blocked. In John's own words, the entrance to the train room was blocked from the outside. And so he goes on to say, we had a bunch of junk down here, and there was a chair, that's this little red chair, that was in front of the door. So let me get this straight. The intruder left through the basement window, closed the door behind him, and somehow magically placed a chair up against the opposite side of the door. John goes on to say, some old things, I moved the chair, went into this room, went back in here. This door was kind of blocked with boxes and a little chair, and you could move the chair and then walk right in. But it would have been pitch black. It would have been tough. Lou Smith, did you say you had to move that chair to get in? John Ramsey, So even Lou Smith is gobsmacked at this statement. Did you say that you had to move that chair to get inside the room? Now, do you remember in the previous analysis, I mentioned this idea that I don't think the Ramseys wanted to draw attention to the basement on the day after Christmas. if they did, John would have, or should have said, hey guys, there's a broken window in the basement. You might want to check it out. It might be a point of entry, but he didn't say that. If he had said that, JonBenet herself probably would have been found within 2 minutes of him saying that. See, in the reality of that morning, in the real-time reality of that morning, the ransom note was doing all the work. The ransom note was saying, JonBenet is not in this house. She's somewhere else. The other thing is, if John had said, wow, guys, there's something suspicious going on in the basement, that broken basement window, which he makes quite a big fuss of in the narrative that he writes. So a couple of years later, he writes a book, and in the real time of the narrative, he says how he thought about this and he was conscious of that. But at the time, in the real time reality, if John had said, hey guys, if he'd put up his hand and said, maybe we should look at this. Well, do you think John would have been the one to find JonBenet? I don't. JonBenet would likely have been found 2 minutes later after John uttered that statement, and worse, from the Ramsey perspective, she would have been found by somebody else. Anyway, John Ramsey says, well, when I came down, one of the things I noticed, that door is still blocked. Mike Cain, the prosecutor. What do you mean it was blocked, John Ramsey? Well, there were some boxes and there was like a bar stool kind of thing sitting there. It wasn't obvious to me that anybody had gone through because I had to move the chair to get in, which I did. Now, I think that's a huge statement from John. Him saying it wasn't obvious to me that anybody had gone through is saying, I think, two things at the same time. I think it's calling into question Fleet White's testimony. It's almost like saying that Fleet White, whatever he said, isn't true or is questionable or is dubious. And you may also think all of this emerged in late April 1997. All of this information about the chair blocking the door. You'd mention it sooner rather than later, even though April 1997 is not that soon. But it's actually what John said in June 1998. And what's fascinating about all of this is 1 year after their first interview, when the Ramseys seemed to be on a highway to getting indicted by a grand jury, John doesn't seem to want to allow the narrative to have an intruder enter the room on the right. And what is the room on the right? Burke's train room. See, you've got to go through the train room to get to the basement window. Conversely, to get from the basement window to the stairs, that takes you to the ground floor. You guessed it. You've got to go past Burke's train room. But it gets even shakier than that. Lou Smith, I wanted to direct your attention, if you could, John, this photograph 71, and especially in the entryways there and into the various rooms. Now, this must have been taken fairly early in the morning of the 26th. Can you describe what you see there? Is there anything that's out of place, or is there anything different from the way you remember it? Because you said you went down into that area, John Ramsey. What is different is, I think that the door is blocked by this drum table. Here's the chair I said was brought to the door, and it's not. I moved the chair to get into the door. So now we have a duplicate situation to the one we had about the open basement window. John said he found it open and closed it. With this, John said he found a chair in front of the door, removed it, except a photo now shows it's not a chair obstructing the entrance, but a table and some boxes, and perhaps it's not just a chair, but other things as well. The point is, the doorway is obstructed, and John claims he couldn't get through without moving a number of items out of the way. Were these items deliberately put in place, or did they happen to be in place anyway? If the latter, that rules both the basement train room as the crime scene and the train tracks inside that room as being used in the crime, as well as the basement window being completely irrelevant in any way whatsoever. But if you say that, what is John's motive for telling the story, true or false, if it effectively destroys the intruder narrative? Well, I've already provided a little clue into that. Isn't it debunking Fleet White? A huge thorn in John Ramsey's side was Fleet White. His testimony in a few areas called John's version into question. Was the window open? Did John cry out when he opened the wine cellar before turning on the light? If so, how did he know someone was inside if it was dark? Would John want the light on when Fleet stepped into the room? So it's possible John's story is either accidentally or purposefully aimed at discrediting Fleet White's story in terms of Fleet's visit to the basement. John might also say if items had been moved around, that someone had contaminated the crime scene in the basement, someone obviously besides himself. Anyway, John Ramsey goes on to say, I don't remember the Easter baskets there at all, but it would have to have been moved. The drum table was over and the chair was also blocking the door. Now, it's quite amazing his attention to detail. He remembers where the Easter baskets were, right? In terms of this particular aspect, is attention to detail is razor sharp.
Yeah, that's true.
You're certain you had to open this door?
Yeah, I'm certain.
Next, Lou Smith says, so do you think that the chair would block the door and nobody would have gotten in there without moving it? John Ramsey, correct.
Uh-oh. I think I heard a toilet flush. Maybe somebody lost a turtle.
You can only imagine what Lou Smith was thinking at this point, because now his pet theory is really hanging in the balance. John Ramsey himself is saying, well, an intruder couldn't actually get there because the door was blocked. So Lou Smith goes on to say, in other words, let's say that the intruder goes into the training room, gets out, let's say that window. John Ramsey, Lou Smith. How, in effect, would he get that chair to block that door if that is the case, is what I'm saying. John Ramsey, I don't know. All I'm saying is that is different than when I went down there. And I think that's really what he's trying to say is someone interfered with the crime scene. You know, there's some kind of contamination going on down there. And someone is possibly dishonest. Someone's story should be discredited. Anyway, Lou Smith says, okay, let's say that you go down there. John Ramsey, All I want to show is that that chair was kind of sitting right in here, and there was something else here. I don't know what it was. It could have been that. Lou Smith, you go down, that's what you see. John Ramsey, I go down, I say, oh, that door is blocked. I moved the chair and went in the room. Lou Smith, so you couldn't have gotten in without moving the chair. John Ramsey, correct.
Let's get the obvious stuff out of the way.
The obvious stuff is that if John couldn't get into that room, well, then an intruder couldn't get in, and now you actually have a situation where that demolishes the intruder theory. And it's from John Ramsey's own testimony here. Anyway, Lou Smith says, and the door was opened or closed? John Ramsey, it was opened. Lou Smith, the door was opened. John Ramsey, correct. Lou Smith, okay. John Ramsey, in that picture, it looks like I came in on this side of the door and would have had to remove that drum table and the Easter basket. Mike Kane, which side are you talking about, the inner side or the lock side? John Ramsey, if I had the door open, it must be the lock side. That chair was right there when I went down there on the lock side of the door. Mike Kane, on the opposite the hinges. John Ramsey, right. And I moved it and entered the room. And in that picture, and then Lou Smith says, and you don't know if you were the first one down there. And that should really be emphasized. Lou's going, wow, you don't know if you were the first person down there. And so here it is. Now the intruder is becoming someone else, anyone else. There's an intruder after the intruder. John Ramsey, I thought the police, they probably went through the house a bit. I don't know where they went. I heard later that Fleet White claimed he went through the basement alone. I don't know if that was before or after I did alone. And this is the meat and potatoes area for the defense. By not tying himself down to exactly when he went down to the basement, it could be that he went down and then Fleet went down and changed something, or Fleet went down and changed something and then he went down. Either way, it potentially throws some shade potentially on Fleet White. Do you see that? Lou Smith, that's why we're trying to determine your time, if you can get that down. John Ramsey, well, I wish I can tell you precisely. Now, it's amazing again, you can talk about the Easter basket and this table and that chair and this and that, but he can't remember the time very precisely. It really is amazing what John can be precise about compared to what he's imprecise about. He can remember exactly in terms of a bunch of clutter where a chair was, a table, a bag of this, a box of that, but he can't remember what time he went down. Anyway, he goes on to say, but it had to be, you see, I think when the first uniformed officer came, French, he very quickly said, I want all you people in the room. And then people started showing in this room, which was the solarium where he talked, is the solarium. And then some other officers came, and my impression at that time was that they did a cursory check of the house. Well, I don't know who transcribed this, but it's not very well done. Anyway, one of the uniformed house, is it not officers, went through the house. That had been fairly early. Mike Kane says something. John Ramsey. We don't. I think it's between 6 and 6:30. So that person should have been the first one to go through the house. I went in the basement, certainly before we were getting ready for the call, until 8. So that would have been 8 o'clock. So we were preparing for that. By 7:30, let's say, and Fleet and I were talking about what we were going to say. Lou Smith. Would that have been before then or after? John Ramsey. It would have been before then, I believe. Lou Smith. So it was before 8 o'clock. John Ramsey. That's right. I'm trying to reconstruct it in my mind. Well, no doubt. Lou Smith says, but when you went to the train room, you had to move these things in order to get into the train room. John Ramsey, right. I had to move the chair. Another possibility John might be aiming at is that intruders were still in the house while everyone was upstairs. Lou Smith, the thing I'm trying to figure out in my mind then is, if an intruder went through the door, he'd almost have to pull the chair behind him. John Ramsey, yeah, that's correct. Lou Smith, because that would have been his exit. John Ramsey, right. Lou Smith, okay. John, yeah, it was blocked. He'd have to move something to get into the room. Lou, and he would have had to move it back if he was in there trying to get out. Is that correct? John, yeah. Lou, so that's not very logical as far as John Ramsey. I think it is. Huh? And so it's quite interesting that Lou is actually in a way kind of arguing with John here and basically arguing the logic of John's argument. And so John goes on to say, I mean, if this person is that bizarrely clever to have not left any good evidence, but left all these little funny little clues around, they certainly are clever enough to pull the chair back when they left. And I think this is such a huge statement from him. I think it, in a way, also gives you a profile, in a sense, of the bizarrely clever ransom note writer. That there's quite a lot of bizarre cleverness that is woven into a lot of what's going on. And John seems to be very aware of that. You know, if that was an explanation you, perhaps as a grand juror, were expected to understand, would you? Would you agree with John that it's logical for an intruder to exit and sort of barricade the door behind him? Because ironically, you have a situation like that with Amanda Knox and Madeleine McCann, that the doors and windows were closed and locked behind them as well. Anyway, John Ramsey says, right, the chair and something else, but it certainly wasn't the Easter baskets. They were sitting there on the drum table, so I never touched them. I just moved the chair and went in. Lou Smith. And that's one of the things that we have to really get clear, because the photographs were taken fairly early that morning. John Ramsey. But I think the question is, would a police officer have done that? Probably not. Would Fleet White have done that? I don't know. And that, I think, is the bottom line of this whole thing. Is he's basically suggesting someone did something in the basement, but probably not a police officer, but probably or possibly Fleet White. Now, you might say, why have we spent so much time dealing with something that is probably a non-issue? Well, I think it is important to understand evidence that's a misdirection in order to get to know how the people in this case think and reason, and how misdirections are potentially contrived. Not just the ransom note, but other misdirections, right? Conversely, I think it's also worth speculating on other possibilities that seem unlikely, and then being able to say whether they are unlikely or not. Now, in my opinion, the chair, like the flashlight in the kitchen, is non-evidence. There's far more important evidence in the basement, such as the paint tray and the wood fragment and the Swiss Army knife and the basement telephone, which is the more likely source of the 911 call, given that it was miscradled. Also, the Star Trek poster in the train room, which may have inspired a reference to foreign faction. Also, a high-tech shoe print left in the grout of the wine cellar. The fibers on the sticky side of the duct tape and the torn FAO Schwartz wrapping of a gift found in the wine cellar. And so all of that is being forgotten about while we are worrying about a chair and an Easter basket and all of this sort of rubble. And isn't that the point, that you are focusing on things that you shouldn't really be focusing on? And you're also focusing on this idea of, should we discredit Fleet White? And that's just taking the whole investigation in a direction away from perhaps where it needs to go. Does that make sense? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.